we are going to be talking about reform. Reform in many different ways. Reform of Catholicism, reform of like Martin Luther and everything, and just the dissatisfaction with the church and all that kind of stuff. So let's get started. We left off talking about the Renaissance and the church before we got into the whole art and everything, of the abuses of power by the church. And so we have 4 Medici popes during this time, and they all just misused their power. They were rich, they had political power, and now they had religious power. These people were getting out of control, way out of control. And they also had the Borgia family to contend with. The Borgia family has Pope Alexander the Sixth, and he was probably one of the absolute most messed up popes. He's really famous for having something called the Banquet of the Chestnuts, which is just grotesque corruption. So he had this banquet. He's the Pope, remember? He has a banquet, and he invites all these people, and basically, it's like an orgy. It literally is an orgy of the Pope. People are like, this is ridiculous. As the wealth and worldliness of the church grew, so did these huge instances of financial corruption, abuse of power, immorality, just grotesqueness. And in return, people's respect for priests, monks, and even the popes really weakened. There was also a period of heavy taxation, which caused even more discontent. The church financed Renaissance artists in these elaborate projects. And it was in the middle class and the peasants who paid for these projects too. So the Sistine Chapel was not done for free, okay? These portraits of the Pope, not done for free. And in the early 1500s, Pope Leo X made money off St. Peter's Basilica, which we talked about last time. Oh, I'm sorry, he needed money for St. Peter's Basilica, and he helped raise money by selling the indulgences. And remember, the indulgences were just pardons issued by the Pope for people that could buy to get into heaven. And you could buy them for dead people. And for almost 1,000 years, the Catholics really believed that after dying, people went to hell or purgatory, where their souls would have to like work off their sins. So indulgences meant that they didn't have to do that. You didn't have to suffer. You could just go right to heaven. And so people were unhappy with the tax, the indulgence, the church practices, and there becomes a major, major shift in Europe. People are really upset with the church. Especially because when we think about the message of Jesus, remember we talked about the Sermon of the Mount, and like if someone slaps you, turn your other side of the face to have them slap you again. Now it was becoming that bad people could do bad things as long as they had money for indulgences. And what was even worse was that things that usually poor people could afford, like marriage and baptism, they were starting to be costing more money too. So if you had a wife and you wanted a child, but you weren't officially married, technically you could not have sex or else you'd go to hell. Like that, technically you would. If you had a baby, and this is like, right after the plague, like people would just die. Children died a lot back then. The idea was if you were baptized, you could go to heaven. But if people couldn't afford to have their kids baptized and then it died when the baby was like, I don't know, 3 or 4, then the baby would go to purgatory and hell. And people were like, what? If you don't want me to have indulgences, that's fine. I'll work my sins off in hell, but at least let me be married and baptize my kids, you know? And this inspired the Protestant Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation all begins in Germany with someone whose name is Martin Luther. And Martin Luther is absolutely fed up. And he has a breaking point when a German priest is selling indulgences to raise money for the Vatican, like we said. So it wasn't like, it wasn't, I don't know what the first purpose for indulgences was, but I could say that, like, let's say you had a really bad, like, you were really bad in your youth and then you kind of turn your life around. Maybe paying for indulgences would make sense. Like, if you, like, we used to steal and stuff because you didn't have any money, but then you kind of turn your life around, you have a better job and this and that. Maybe that makes sense. But during this time, it was like, want to not go to hell? We need money for the Vatican. You could get in on this. You could get in on the ground floor of the Vatican. Then you won't go to hell. And Martin Luther was like, what in the world does building a Vatican have to do with your soul and have to do with being with Jesus in heaven? And so he's pissed off and he starts to write his theses, his 99 theses against indulgences, against the church, and he posts them on the door of the Wittenberg church. And what is really interesting is that Martin Luther, it wasn't at first intended for people to know about all of this stuff, because he wrote it all in academic Latin, which a lot of people didn't understand. But when he nailed them to the church door, he was following a common practice of the time. The problem was that his thesis started to stimulate discussions because people were learning a little bit more. Not a lot of people knew Latin back then, but during the Renaissance stuff, people start to learn Latin. And these theses start to stimulate a discussion around intellectuals. So it wasn't like everyday people were going up and reading them, but, you know, Mr. Smarty Pants was going up and reading them. But soon, thanks to the newly invented printing press, which I have the picture here, the theses were published, and the work started to spread around Europe, and a lot of people read them. Not just intellectual people, but like clergy, and even like poor people that were smart and had enough education to know Latin. It causes a great change in the church. The main idea of the theses was that getting into heaven should be based on your faith, not money. The Bible is the source of truth, not the Pope. We need to get rid of the Pope. Priests don't have power. Anyone can talk to God. The Bible should be translated from Latin to German so everyone can read it. No more indulgences. And the clergy should be able to marry. It wasn't just like overnight that people had like, oh my God, these are such good ideas. But over time, people started reacting to them. And we have the spread of what we called Protestantism. And Protestantism really kicks off with someone named John Calvin and the idea of Calvinism. Calvinism is a religious term, but it can also be a sociology term, which we don't have to know for now. But anyway, he thought that the only way to salvation was through faith. And also, he believed in the idea of predestination, saying that God decided long ago if you were saved or were you not saved. How you live reflects the choice. So he's basically saying, if you're good, then you're good. You just have to be good. And if you're going to be bad, then that's just how your life's going to be. But you wanted to act like you were good, because people who are perfectly human are perfectly imperfect. And his idea is that God would not mess up. So if God said you're good, then you're good. Just act good. Only God can fix things, and only God knows, but he works through people. So the idea is, if, what am I trying to say here? Nothing humans can do, either good or bad, are going to change how it all ends. So you just have to act good, and you just have to know in your heart that God made you good and he would not screw it up. And the other half of this idea of Protestantism is the idea of being a Puritan. And this is another name for Calvinists, but it's in England and Scotland. And so the Protestant reform starts this huge shift between Catholics and Protestants. And we have this person, Henry VIII, who hated Protestants, absolutely hated them. He wants to be Catholic. He thinks Martin Luther is stupid. He decides to call himself the defender of the faith. But there's an issue with Henry. He wants a son, and he gets married to someone named Catherine, and he only has a daughter. This isn't happy for him. He doesn't want a daughter. He wants a son because he wants to continue his heir. He wants to continue his throne. So he wants to have the marriage annulled, which means kind of like a divorce. It's like declaring the marriage invalid. And the Catholic Church says no. The Catholic Church is like, you can't do that. You got married and you don't have power to, like, as much as it was about religion, it was also just the popes being like, I'm stronger than a king. Like the King of England, Henry VIII, wants to get his marriage annulled. And they're like, no. And this was because he fell in love with someone whose name was Anne Boleyn. So I want to go over some of Henry VIII's wives after we talk about, really quick, the idea of Protestantism. So in 1534, Henry writes the Act of Supremacy, which is passed by a parliament about making England Protestant, which is really interesting because he said that he hated it. And King Henry VIII becomes the head of the church. He names himself Archbishop, and he grants himself a divorce. He has the idea of Anglicism. Remember how the beginning of England was Anglo-Saxons before 1066 and the Normans took over, the Vikings? Well, he kind of calls it back to the Anglo-Saxons by calling it Anglicism. Anyway, he grants himself a divorce, and people are like, dude, I don't think you can do that. But he's like, yes, I can, because not only am I the king, but I'm also the Archbishop of the Church of England, don't you know? All right, you guys, so I want to go over King Henry VIII's wives. Our first is Catherine of Aragon. He divorced her, as we said in the last slide, and they had one child whose name was Mary. The next is who he wanted to divorce Catherine to be with, Anne Boleyn. And Anne Boleyn was a bit of a seductress, and some people said that she may have even been a witch, and she bewitched Henry because Henry basically threw away Catholicism for her, threw away the relationship with Rome to be with her, and she said that she would have a son. And she didn't. She had one child, Elizabeth, and Henry VIII was not happy. He was like, I thought that you said we were going to have a son. And so she is arrested on these charges of adultery that are like really made up. And some people think that maybe Henry did all of this because he had a big personality change after Catherine of Aragon. So he used to be like a young, hot, handsome kind of guy. Oh, let me get the picture up. And he falls off his horse and goes into a coma for 2 hours before anyone finds him. And after he wakes up, he's really different. So some people think that if we had modern medicine back then, we could find that maybe he had some type of injury to his brain that caused him to be a little bit more cruel. Or he was just cruel. That's the option too. So Anne Boleyn is charged with all of these crimes of adultery and ends up being beheaded. And Henry doesn't care. 11 days later, he marries Jane Seymour, and Jane is able to have a son. And it's kind of said that he was like, she was his true love, but she ends up dying. And then the next is Anne of Cleves. And Anne of Cleves was kind of like a Tinder situation. So it was like a blind date. And Henry was shown a picture of Anne of Cleves. And this is probably something like the picture. And it turned out she did not look like that. So literally, she gets to meet him to have the marriage. And he's like, you're the ugliest woman I've ever seen. And so they get married because it was a political marriage because she was from Germany. And they end up getting the marriage annulled because the idea was that they may have never even had sex because he literally was repulsed by her. Like, she was that ugly, apparently. She doesn't look very ugly, considering Jane Seymour looks like that. Anyways, yeah. So they get divorced, and she has like the best kind of situation of all of Henry's wives, because she just gets divorced and she gets like a little small castle, and she ends up being called the beloved sister of the king, which is kind of weird. So he just wanted to forget the whole mess with Anna Cleves that ever happened. The next is he marries Catherine Howard, and at this point, she was like in her early teens, and he's like, I want to say in his 40s or 50s. And he's become kind of crazy. He's been divorcing or killing, or his wives are just dying. And on top of that, so back then, being fat was like a good thing because it meant you had a lot of like money and wealth and stuff so that you didn't have to work. Just like back then too, being really pale meant you weren't like a worker. Like being tan meant you spent time outside. Like if you were tan and skinny back then, they were like, oh, she must be a peasant. So being like really fat and pale was like really hot. But Henry was like beyond that because he was also like deteriorating. Like he had a cut on his leg that was like an open sore. Like he smelled really bad. Like he was really kind of gross and ugly, and yeah. So Catherine Howard is a teenager and, surprise, surprise, cheats on him, disgusting man, to be with like other people her age, and he finds out and she's beheaded. And then the last one is Catherine, and she survived Henry. Henry dies. Henry just dies. And so then the question is, who's going to be the next? Because we have a female from a first marriage, a female from a second marriage, and then a third son, a son from a different marriage. And it ends up that Edward VI is going to be the king, but he dies just a couple, he becomes king at 9, he dies a couple years ago at age 16. And so the next person in the line would be the firstborn daughter, which is Mary. And she is called Bloody Mary. She used the term Bloody Mary because she is really ruthless. She wants to make the country Catholic again. She's like, oh, my father, he was a disgusting Protestant. He just wanted to have affairs. I was always the rightful queen. So she tries to get England to be Catholic again. And so they start to burn Protestants at the stake. But eventually Mary passes, and Elizabeth from way back, Anne Boleyn, ends up being the queen. And Elizabeth I is kind of a good queen. She was locked in the Tower of London for her early life because, you know, having a daughter, it wasn't a good thing. And people call her the Virgin Queen because she never got married. And they actually named Virginia after her. Virgin, yeah. Because she was kind of integral in the exploration phase of England. And so Queen Elizabeth, like I said, becomes queen after Mary dies. But she wants to reform Catholics and the Protestants. She wants prayer to be in English, not in Latin. So she kind of is not too bad. But the Council of Trent, she ends up rejecting the Protestants, and she doesn't want to burn them at the stake, but a lot of the Puritans end up leaving to go to America under her because they want to get away from her. She's a little bit more Catholic, but she's just not interested in embracing this whole situation with the Catholics and the Protestants. So we have Elizabeth I kind of ending our class. This is all that I have for now. We've talked about, we started way back at the dawn of civilization, 10,000 BC. We went through Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Persian Empire. Then we moved over to Greece, ancient Greece, classical Greece, Hellenistic Greece. Then we went to Rome, the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire. Moving on to the fall of the Roman Empire in the Dark Ages. then the High Middle Ages and the Byzantine Empire. Then we move to the Plague, the Late Middle Ages, the Late High Middle Ages, I guess you could call it. Then the Renaissance, and now Reform. And we are going to be ending the course here. Again, I'm doing this because I want for you to have more time to work on your final essay. So please do reach out to me if you have any questions, and anything that I just listed from this last slide to the first slide might make an appearance on our final exam. So make sure you study. Bye.